Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tabakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. And I welcome Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali to our session today. I also welcome all of you to today's Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series session featuring Dr. Jenny Rose of Claremont Graduate University, who will speak on a nice morality, some early meetings between Zoroastrians and North Americans. I'm grateful to my colleagues, Professor Enrico Raffaelli and Professor Miguel Angel Toledo, for co-convening the series. I would like to express my gratitude to our collaborators, the Federation of Zoroastrian Associations of North America, Zoroastrian Society of Ontario, the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation that has enabled the establishment of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach in their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Toledo, will be introducing our speaker today, Dr. Jenny Rose.
Thank you very much, Professor Tabakoli. It is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rose, a very well-known scholar in the field. And let me just say very, very general words about his very impressive and very famous work. Dr. Jenny Rose is currently a research fellow at the Claremont Graduate University, where she taught classes on the Zoroastrian religion for 2 decades, after graduating in Iranian studies from Columbia University. Her proposed volume for Routledge, titled The Zoroastrian World, co-edited with Albert de Jong and Sarah Stewart, is in process with contributions from across the Zoroastrian world, as well as from non-Zoroastrian academics. Dr. Rose is scheduled to be the study leader for several educational tours next year, one of which explores the Silk Road across Central Asia. The other visits European museums which house ancient Iranian and related Central Asian collections. Please let me welcome Dr. Rose. Thank you very much for joining our Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I will share my screen now and hope that you can see this. Can you all see that? Is that
Yes.
good? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Miguel for that introduction and for Professor Tabakoli and also Enrico Raffaelli for inviting me to give this presentation today. I'm going to focus mostly on some of the research that I did for my most recent book, which is this. It's not a plug, but it's so that you can see it. It's called Between Boston and Bombay, and it looks at the cultural and commercial encounters between mostly New Englanders and Parsi Zoroastrians from the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. Before those personal encounters took place, Americans would have known a little bit about the Persian religion through their education in classical studies, through European travelogues, and towards the end of the 18th century, they might have come across a translation of some of the Zoroastrian texts into French that came out in 1771. In 1784, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and it was after that date that American merchant mariners began to sail across to the lands where the British had already been, to the East Indies. But they also began to visit Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. That's modern Kolkata, Chennai, and Mumbai. And in Bombay, at the end of the 18th century, the Parsis had already been settling for about 100 years. Many of them had come initially under commission from the British East India Company, who valued their skills in shipbuilding, in carpentry, and in weaving. And it was in Bombay that the American entrepreneurs first came into a close contact with Parsi brokers, traders, and shipbuilders. And many of those early connections are documented in personal letters, in journals, and also in naval logbooks, which are held in American archives. So in this presentation, I want to look at some of these first-hand American accounts of meetings with Parsis, but I also want to look at some of the letters that the Parsis wrote to their American clients, and some of the artifacts that they sent to America, to some of the very early museum collections. I'm going to end with a few references to Parsis who made their way to North America through England mostly, just before and during the early years of the American Civil War. So the phrase "a nice morality," which was in the title for the talk, comes from a reference to the Zoroastrian religion by an American state representative who was in London in late 1771. This delegate had recently come across Anctil du Perron's 2-volume, 3-book work titled Zendavesta, Ouvrage de Zoroastre. And this contained, as many of you will know, observations on Parsi Zoroastrian rituals and customs, and some of the earliest translations of Avestan texts into a modern European language, obviously French. The diplomat in question in London in late 1771 was the colonial agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, Benjamin Franklin. In early 1772, Franklin wrote to a colleague in Newport, Rhode Island. This is what he wrote. "There is lately published in Paris a work entitled Zendavesta, or the Writings of Zoroaster." And then he paraphrases the frontispiece comments, "containing the theological, philosophical, and moral ideas of that legislator, and the ceremonies of religious worship that he established, translated from the original." Franklin continued, "I have cast my eye over the religious part. It seems to contain a nice morality, mixed with abundance of prayers, ceremonies, and observations." Franklin's letter was addressed to a fellow amateur scientist, the Reverend Ezra Stiles, who later became the president of Yale College, which of course is now Yale University. Many of the sons of New England merchant families attended either Yale or Harvard College, and of course others were tutored by students from one of those two prestigious institutions. Some of these young men were the first Americans to encounter Zoroastrians in Bombay. One such individual was the son of this Salem-based sea captain named Elias Haskett Darby, whose fleet of ships began rounding the Cape of Good Hope, bound for the East Indies, in late 1784, so very early on. In September of 1788, his son, Elias Haskett Darby Jr., also known as Haskett, wrote this letter. He's sending it from Bombay to his father, who's back in Salem, Massachusetts, and it is, I think, the earliest document that records a direct interaction between an American and a Parsi, an American post-independence. A few pages into this letter, Haskett states, and you can just, I don't know whether you can see on the right-hand side, and I've enlarged it up top. "My broker's name is Nasovanji Monakji. He is said to be worth £200,000 sterling, and that's a huge amount in 1788. Nusawanji Monakji was an established broker for the East India Company. His older brother, Framji, was the East India Company master shipbuilder at the same dockyard in Bombay that had been built by their grandfather, Loji Nusawanji. In 1735, Loji had been brought from Gujarat on commission by the East India Company with a team of Parsi shipwrights. And the Gujarati term for a shipwright was Wadya, which then becomes attached to the family as a surname. Another Salem mariner was Jacob Crowninshield. Crowninshield, acting as a supercargo, that is the ship's officer who's in charge of the cargo for Elias Haskett Darby Sr., also relied on Nusawanji Monakji as his broker. And this, of course, then set the trend for other American mariners to work directly through Parsi merchants, whose fees were lower than those of the British and other European brokers. In 1799, Jacob Crowninshield became the first treasurer of the newly founded East India Marine Society of Salem. Mariners who belonged to the society were expected to keep journals of their voyages. They were supposed to take notes of the people and the cultures that they encountered, and to collect artifacts for the Society's Cabinet of Curiosities. Another founding member of the East India Marine Society in Salem was named Ichabod Nichols, and he also used Nusawanji Monakji as his Bombay broker. Ichabod's son was George. George had been tutored by a Harvard graduate until the grand old age of 13, when he started working as a clerk in his father's store. But by the age of 17, he'd set off to sea. By the time he'd reached 21, he'd already sailed to Scandinavia and Russia twice, and around the Cape of Good Hope to Indonesia and back. That was a 15-month voyage. Towards the end of 1799, Ichabod put George in charge of the cargo on his ship, the Active, with a mission to sail to Bombay and to return with a cargo of cotton, which Ichabod had already requested by letter from Nusawanji. George arrived in Bombay in early 1800, returning to Salem later that year with this reply from Nusawanji. So this is the original letter. In it, the Parsi broker states that he's acted on the directions he received in supplying George and his captain with the items that they required. He continues, it's the second paragraph, if you can see it. I hope you will remember me continually by recommending me to your friends coming out to this port to transact in their business as you indulged me therewith. And he concludes, having given a shawl handkerchief to Mr. G. Nichols, hope your acceptance thereon. And in his late life autobiography, George refers to this original gift of a shawl handkerchief as a camel's hair or cashmere shawl that Mr. Nichols, his father, had given to his mother. Later, Nusawanji sent a larger shawl, which is now in the Peabody Essex Museum collection. It's called the Moon Shawl because it's got this great round circle in the middle of it. George recalls receiving the first shawl from Nusawanji, and he gave in return a series of books about historic sea voyages from Christopher Columbus onwards, all in English, to Nusawanji. So there's this kind of frequent gift exchange that points to a very highly collaborative nature of the business relationship between Parsis and Americans. And one of the earliest donations to the East India Marine Society's collection in Salem was this portrait that was donated by Captain John Dalling, who was the master of a ship that sailed regularly between Salem or Boston and India. The portrait was painted in Bombay in the European style popular at the time. You can see that Nosarwanji Manekji is sitting on a Western style chair next to a table. The table has got a cloth covering with an ink pot and a quill and papers that imply that he was writing business letters, and he's clutching a piece of paper in his hand. But he's wearing the very formal Parsi clothing of the time called the jama pichori. The jama's this long white robe that buttons sideways. It's a precursor to the dogli, and it goes to the floor. And the pichori is this very long, sometimes a 30-foot piece of cotton that was wrapped around the waist that made the men look like they've got rather fat tummies. He's got a salmon-coloured cashmere shawl around his shoulders, a half-rolled turban, and if you look at his feet, he's got those wonderful roll-toed shoes called modshris, which some of the traditional priests still wear in Mumbai today. In the same year that the portrait was presented to the museum, Nosarwanji himself sent a set of clothes almost identical to those that are in the portrait. And such items of clothing were often part of an annual street parade in Salem that was organised by the East India Marine Society to display all the new curiosities that had been brought from far away. And the clothes were often modelled by members of the society. After the arrival of the set of clothing, that's in Salem. This is where the parade would have been. After the arrival of the set of clothing, the society arranged for a life-size wooden figure in Nosarwanji's likeness. They obviously used the portrait to model the figure on. It was commissioned by the society and exhibited wearing the set of Parsi clothes that he had sent in the museum. The Peabody Essex Museum, as it is now, has an East India Marine Hall that was constructed in 1825. And we know from accounts of visitors that this image of Nosarwanji was placed there along with other figures of Indian merchants to kind of greet the arrivals as they went into the museum. So I also discovered when I was doing my research that Nosarwanji's shoes still remain, although there's no sign of the turban and the shawl, but the shoes are still there. And they're a bit scuffed, so I do wonder how often they were worn in the annual street parade around Salem. At the end of 1807, the burgeoning American trade with India, particularly Bombay, was really badly affected by President Jefferson's implementation of an embargo against both Britain and France. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. Although the embargo was lifted in March of 1809, trade remained uneven. We have a letter from the end of November 1810 from Nosarwanji, in which he writes 4 lines down that only one ship, the Galloway from New York, had visited the entire season. The supercargo on the Galloway was a young Scotsman named John Johnston, who'd first sailed to Bombay on the same ship the previous year. He'd arrived on that initial trip with instructions from the Galloway's owner to liaise with Nosarwanji Manakji Seth, or merchant, a dubak, or man of business. Nosarwanji is reputed a person in line of the highest respectability. You will therefore immediately call upon him. He will assist you in your custom house business and advise as to the best mode of disposing of your cargo. According to Johnston's journals, he and Nosarwanji Manekji not only discussed business, but also spoke at length about the Parsi Zoroastrian religion. Johnston comments, "The Persians of the sect of Zoroaster are very numerous in Bombay, and every morning and evening are to be seen without the walls in hundreds, prostrating themselves in religious adoration before the sun. Their ideas of God, of the creation, the deluge, heaven and hell, are nearly the same with our own, as are likewise their views of the moral duties. Johnston's willingness to compare Parsi belief and ethos favourably with his own Scottish Presbyterianism is in a very sharp contrast to the objectives of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, which had been founded earlier in 1810. This was a non-denominational organisation supported mostly by New England Presbyterians and Congregationalists. The original charter for the English East India Company had prohibited Christian missionaries in India, but in July 1813, the charter was changed in Parliament, which allowed entry for missionaries. And the eagerness of the American Board of Missions to gain access to British India can be seen in this painting of a ship leaving Salem for India early in 1812. So this is the year before the ban was lifted. On board are a couple of very newly ordained missionaries and their wives, and this was followed not long afterwards by a ship out of Philadelphia. Both ships made their way to Calcutta. At Calcutta, they were told very firmly by the British, because they weren't allowed to proselytize, that they had to turn around and go back home or take another ship away from India. Two of them sneaked on board a ship that made its way from Calcutta to Bombay, got off in Bombay, and were given a temporary refuge by the then governor, Sir Evan Nepean, who allowed them to stay. And when the ban was lifted, the first Protestant missionary was set up in Bombay by those two American missionaries. So this took place in December of 1813. And one of those missionaries was the Reverend Gordon Hall. And it was Hall's memoir that was one of several missionary accounts that helped to broaden American awareness of Indian religions and culture. Although I have to say he didn't write much about the Parsis. We do have the writings of a young Harvard-educated Salem resident who arrived in Bombay in 1817 that do provide a lengthy account of Parsi religion and history. This young man's name is William Rogers, and his insights seem to have been informed by his dealing with the Parsis that he met in Bombay. The first couple of Parsis that he met in person as he disembarked from the quay were his brokers, who happened to be Nussawanji Manekji's sons, Nauroji and Jahangirji. And they'd continued their father's monopoly on American business in the city. This page of William's journal describes Jamsetji Bomanji Wadia, who was another relative of Nussawanji Manekji, who had become the new master shipbuilder at the Bombay dockyard. According to William, Jamsetji was said to be a very shrewd, a capable draftsman, and a man of great impartiality, who arbitrated in all Parsi disputes. And it was Jamsetji, as the master shipbuilder, who had built the first man of war for the British Royal Navy in Bombay, and that was the HMS Minden. And you can see in the corner of the portrait is a depiction of the HMS Minden, and Jamsetji Bomanji is holding the plans in his right hand. Several American reports from later in the 19th century state that during the war between Britain and the United States, the Minden was the flag of truce ship from which, in September 1814, Francis Scott Key watched the rocket's red glare over Fort McHenry and composed the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner. William's journal was probably written on behalf of his older brother Richard, who was the captain of the ship that they sailed to Bombay on, the Tartar, and it would have been to fulfill the Marine Society's requirements that its members should provide a record of people and places encountered on a voyage. William's account of the Parsi Zoroastrian religion was based largely on information that he gleaned from, as I said, Parsis that he'd met. Apart from his brokers, the sons of Nusawanji, his supplier was also a Parsi. His name was Shahpurji Sorabji, and Shahpurji Sorabji acted as William Rogers' guide to the city. William writes that what he was told by Sorabji matched other verbal accounts of the Dasturs, the chief priests. He described Mullah Feroz, the Kadmi Dastur of the Dadi Seth Atash Behram. That was the only Atash Behram in the city at the time. He described the Dastur of that Atash Behram as the most learned of the Parsis and their high priest, but we don't know whether he met him in person. William's journal offers an invaluable record of what contemporary Parsis considered to be the most important aspects of their religion to share with others. This section is a translation of 16 Sanskrit passages or shlokas, which describe Parsi hospitality and civic philanthropy and define areas of Parsi separateness in matters of religious practice and domestic ritual, particularly in relation to women. The last passage, which I haven't shown here, I've missed off 2 or 3 at the end, reports that the local Hindu rulers' positive reception of the Parsis when they had arrived in Gujarat several hundred years earlier was very warm. This response by the Raja must have resonated with the Parsis as they positioned themselves in the Bombay hierarchy of the early 19th century. In the section, the Raja wishes joy to those who walk faithfully in the way of Hormuz, that's Ahura Mazda, increase of their generations, abundance of wealth, and that the beauties of person and mind which now adorn should continue to distinguish them among nations to the end of time. In the decades following William's visit, Parsi letters to newspapers and Panchayat records indicate that both Anglicization and Christian missionary activity had become more pervasive. During the 1830s and 40s, missionaries in Bombay encouraged interreligious debate, assuming that Christianity would be shown to be superior, and these discussions often played out in the Indian press. One such public correspondence took place between Pestanji Monokji, the editor of the Parsi publication Jami Jamshid, and the Reverend John Murray Mitchell, who was the editor of a Christian periodical titled The Native's Friend. The whole debate was published in full in 1845 by Kawasji Fodonji, who owned the publishing house Daftar Ashkar. The arguments in the book were reviewed by a US naval physician, William Ruschenberger, who'd been in Bombay a decade earlier as part of a US delegation. Ruschenberger's dubash, or interpreter at that time, was a Parsi named Munchiji, and Ruschenberger describes that they had lots of conversations in English, including about religion. So we know that he was really interested in the religion. So Ruschenberger had obviously read about the debate, and he assesses it. The 2 editors, the one Parsi and the one Christian, and he writes, "It seems to me almost certain that all the Parsis who read this production will be satisfied, not only that the Reverend J.M. Mitchell has been routed in argument, but that a blow has been struck which must retard the progress of Christianity in Hindustan." A telling part of the discussion concerned the merits of Thomas Paine's deist views. John Murray Mitchell had goaded his Parsi counterpart to name one single American who followed Paine's political opinions and his philosophy. Pestanji Monokji had noted that many leading Americans at the turn of the 18th century had espoused Paine's views, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Monokji addressed Paine's religious and political views in relation to his own beliefs. He said, Though I might not be able to harmonize certain doctrines of the Zend-Avesta with the Age of Reason, that's Paine's work, yet that is no reason why I should reject all the doctrines and arguments advanced by Paine. So there's this interesting debate going on between Parsi Zoroastrians and British Christians and American Christians as to the way forward. And Pestanji, in thinking about Christianity in both Britain and America, thought that the progress that had been made in both places was due to advances in intellectual thinking as well as technology, and not due to a kind of Christian morality. So this Parsi contribution to a discussion of the impact of deism in both America and India is taking place as the Transcendentalist movement is emerging in New England. While Pestanji Manokji in Bombay states that he had studied and minutely investigated the evidence of Christianity and the authority of the Bible, so in Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo Emerson had read both Anquetil du Perron's Zend-Avesta and du Perron's earlier précis of the Zoroastrian religion. Emerson cited the good sentences of both the Zend-Avesta and another work which was popular among Parsis named the De Satire. And Emerson had an English version of the De Satire, which had just been translated in 1818, mostly through the impetus of Muller Feroz. Emerson claimed that he didn't care whether either of these texts, the Zend-Avesta or the De Satire, were genuine antiques or modern counterfeits, since for him all truth was timeless and eternally relevant. Both Emerson and Henry David Thoreau promoted Zoroaster as the originator of an ancient model of enlightenment, which belongs to all humanity. Of course, in this universalist scheme, there's no need for conversion from one faith to another, nor is there any impetus to meet actual adherents of other faiths. By the time that Thoreau wrote his famous passage about the pure Walden water mingling with the sacred waters of the Ganges, ice from the frozen lakes of Massachusetts had become one of the most lucrative exports from the US to Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. In Bombay, several Parsis were among the subscribers to the building of an ice house near the docks that was purpose-built to receive the American ice. So you can see in this photograph, the entrance to the docks is on the right-hand side of the photograph. The ice house is the domed building that you can see sandwiched between the Scottish church in the near foreground and Hornby House, which was the recorder's court. It's the square building behind the ice house. Not only were Parsis involved in the ice industry, but since the 1820s, they'd also acted on behalf of American companies in exporting opium to China. After the Anglo-American Wars ended in 1815, American markets wanted more tea, porcelain, and silk from China than they had ready money in the form of silver dollars to pay for. So the drug from India became a significant and practical element of the goods exchange. New England merchants, including Augustine Hurd, Samuel Russell, and Warren Delano, he was the great-grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, began buying Indian opium from Bombay and Calcutta. They often liaised with Parsi brokerage and trading houses in the receiving, storing, and then the marketing of the drug in China. These trade connections sometimes led to other adventures. In 1848, the captain of a Hurd Company opium clipper, the Frolic, accompanied his Parsi broker, who was also a trained opium examiner. His name was Kosetji Mawanji Wadia, another one of the Wadia family, on an overland trip from Bombay. They travelled over the Western Ghat Mountains to the Buddhist rock caves of Kali and then down to Pune. We have Kosetchi Mwanji's handwritten account of this journey. He's the one in the middle, which took place during the week of December the 7th to the 15th in 1848. Kosetchi relied on his network of Parsi acquaintances to provide suitable transport and accommodation along the way. During the trip, Captain Faucon and Kosetchi Mwanji often took tea and refreshments together, and this was a departure from previous Parsi strictures on eating or drinking with non-Parsis. After travelling by palanquin to Khandala at the top of the mountain, the two adventurers descended to the Buddhist caves at Karli, where, Kosetchi Mwanji notes, they minutely examined the interior of the caves to the delight of Captain Faucon. When they reached Pune, a local Parsi businessman, Edilji Hormuzji, the son of a local kotwal or magistrate, put them up in a house near the cantonment. And over the next couple of days, Kosetchi and Faucon toured the sights of Pune with their host. This included the bazaar, the palaces, temples, and even the jail. On their last morning, they took a carriage ride to have a view of the Parsis' burial place on a hill adjacent to the English burial ground. But we don't have any reference to Faucon's reaction to that experience. While readers in both London and New York in the autumn of 1851 were being introduced to the enigmatic Parsi with the made-up name in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, an actual Parsi named Ardashir Kosetchi Wadia, who was a distant relative also of Nusawanji Manetji and Kosetchi Mwanji, was visiting the east coast of America on business. Ardashir was a marine engineer. He'd studied in England and had built the first private steamship in Bombay in 1833. His itinerary in America is not well recorded, but it is known that he took a ship to the east coast from England in late 1851, and this was probably on one of the new steamships that was coming out of Liverpool. There was the Cunard line and the Inman line. And he probably took one of those ships across to the northeastern coast of America to buy various wood cutting machines. At the time of his visit to the east coast, his relatives back in Bombay, led by the firm of Dosaboy Mwanji, he's the older brother of Kosetchi, were acting as agent brokers for several New England shipping merchants, including Bacon's and Company of Boston. The financial records of this company detail the invoices of shipments that were going to and from India on several ships, and they had wonderful names: the Quickstep, the Santiago, the Sweepstakes, and the Spirit of the Times. The cargo included many items that were provided for or shipped on behalf of Dosaboy Mwanji, and his company was supplying different types of wool to America, along with Canton silk, tea from China, rags. These were presumably for making paper, cow hides and goat hides, some from Aden, Yemen, that were used for making shoes and belts in America, along with spices, pepper, mustard seeds, saffron, medicinal plants. And also the elaborately carved blackwood furniture that was made of Indian rosewood that became very popular along the east coast of the United States. In 1853, an American author and journalist, whose name was Bayard Taylor, describes his visit, and he writes of his indebtedness to Dosaboy Mwanji. He says that with the other members of the firm, Dosaboy had shown him much kindness. He described Dosaboy Mwanji as one of the principal merchants to whose trading house most American vessels were consigned. And as such, Dosaboy was obviously a key figure in Bombay civic life. Bayard Taylor commented that there were no American merchants in Bombay at the time, nor even a consul, as the last American consul, Edward Elahé, had left Bombay for health reasons. Taylor noted that Elahé had appointed Mr. Dosaboy Mwangi as his agent in his stead, but that the latter had no authority to act in consular capacity. This temporary role as American vice consul in Bombay indicates Dosaboy Mwangi's standing with his American clients. He seems to have had very good personal relations with these clients, as evidenced in some of the items that we have in the Peabody Essex Museum, one of which is this Parsi cap that is noted as made especially for and presented to Edward F. Dalland by Dosaboy Mwangi in 1858. Dalland was a Harvard graduate who worked with his family's shipping firm in Boston and had sailed for Bombay in the spring of that year. He conducted business with Dosaboy Mwangi and came back not only with this cap, but with a whole suit of clothing that we think he gave to his sister. In this antebellum period, it's not only commodities that were arriving from India to the shores of North America, but also Parsis themselves. They were venturing from Bombay to England and then on to New York and Boston and points along that northeastern seaboard. One visitor that we know who came from late 1859 to 1861 was Dosaboy Mwangi's nephew, Rostamji Hirjiboy. And he was hosted by representatives of Bacon's, the shipping company with which his uncle's firm collaborated. During an extensive trip along that northeastern coastline, Rustamji visited the Essex Institute, which was the former East India Marine Society and then became the Peabody Essex Museum. And in the Essex Institute was his relative's portrait, Nosawanji Manekji's portrait. But we don't know whether Rustamji actually saw the portrait. But we do know that he visited the museum because his signature is in the guest book for October the 9th, 1860. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's the 9th line up from the bottom. It could be Rustamji, who during this visit took tea with a Salem resident named Caroline Howard King. In her memoirs, Caroline described the visit of a real live Parsi with a tall calico headdress to her home. Apparently, this real life Parsi had no qualms in sitting down to tea with non-Parsis. Caroline writes, "It was a revelation to me that a fire worshipper could take tea like ordinary mortals." She noted that her visitors spoke much better English than she and her friend. When questioned about Parsi belief, her guest explained that the worship of fire was only symbolic. He told his hostess, "We look upon the sun as the source of all good, light, heat, and life. So when we pray, we turn our faces to the sun as the visible type of the invisible spirit which rules the earth." In early 1861, while in New York, Rustamji Hirjiboy joined a Masonic lodge in Brooklyn. He was initiated rapidly through the first, second, and third degrees to become a master mason within only 3 weeks. Rustamji left the States in the fall of that year of 1861. In late November, Dosaboy Mwangi, his uncle, wrote to Bacon's in Boston, sending heartfelt thanks for the kind and handsome treatment our Mr. Rustamji received at your hands, both at Boston and New York. Rustamji arrived back in Bombay early the next year to be welcomed by his family, who'd been concerned for his safety as he crossed the seas while the American Civil War raged. Rustamji left no known record of his time in America, but we do have a brief insight into some of his thoughts concerning certain aspects of the American way of life. A few years after his return to Bombay, an American guest at his uncle Kosetji Mohanji's home reported meeting there a young man of the family who had studied in London for 4 years and lived for a year and a half in the United States, and this must be Rustomji, whom the writer described as a fine-looking, intelligent, and agreeable in manners. After cakes and wine together, Rustomji made a neat little speech, expressing regret that present social customs in India did not allow for the same free and hospitable entertainment in family homes as he had experienced in America. I'm very conscious that I'm talking to a few people who are in Toronto, and I haven't mentioned Canada at all in this presentation. So I want to end with a reference to a diary type account of a journey that was made to North America by a couple of Parsi entrepreneurs who arrived in New York in early July in 1862. They came on board the Great Eastern Steamship, which only made a few crossings, and afterwards it was used to lay cables for the Marconi telegraph. After a few days in New York, these two Parsi entrepreneurs set out on a grand tour of the Northeast that began in Montreal at Donegana's Hotel near Bonsecours Market in Montreal, which then became the site of the Notre Dame Hospital, which I think is still there. They marveled. From Montreal, they go down to Niagara Falls, where they marvel at the thundering waters of the falls, and then they head back into the US. They become caught up in events that relate to the Civil War as they visit Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, St. Louis, and down through Columbus, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, ending in Washington, D.C., where they hear Abraham Lincoln speak. En route, they're able not only to visit military installations, but also to spend time at industrial factories and charitable institutions. Both were struck by the warm reception that they received from ordinary citizens throughout their trip. And perhaps their welcome had been primed over the 60 years since Nusawanji Manekji's shoes made that first figurative step onto the American continent. And I'd like to end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose. And please let me introduce now Professor Raffaeli, who would lead the session, the Q&A session. So please, if you have questions, Professor Raffaeli.
I'll just share the session, and thanks a lot, Dr. Rose. I'm sorry I couldn't introduce you, although I should have said, I don't know if it's been said, that you're the author of the textbook that has introduced tens, maybe hundreds of students to the study of Zoroastrianism at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where I am right now, right after class. Your class started right after my class. So I will take questions if there's any question, either just someone who wants to speak or maybe just in the chat box. Yeah, I'm reading a lot of enthusiastic comments.
Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, please.
Yes, please, because otherwise it's hard for me to see.
Yes, I realise we're all still very little, aren't we?
Yeah. So first of all, I guess I can first ask a question that I'm reading in by Kirsty Schroff in the chat box. So do you have information on a series of letters called the Parsi letters published in the US press in the 1860s? Do you know of their authenticity and the author? Because these letters purport to be written by an Indian merchant against the tariff system and instructing Americans on how to run their industries. They were addressed to Sahib Horace Greeley and are confusingly thought to have been written by a Hindu merchant. The name of the author is given as Adersi Curiosi Boy. Curiosi Boy. I don't know if you've heard.
No, but it rings a bell, Kirsty, and I can look up. I do know something about it, but it was not within the time period that I was looking at. I think it's a bit later. but I don't know, perhaps someone else will know more about Ardashir Kuriosi boy. I think they were made up. I don't think they're genuine Parsi letters, but we can talk about that when I've done a bit more research.
Well, it would be interesting to see if they're made up, what was the rationale, the reason why
Yes,
to make
exactly.
it attributed to a Parsi. Yeah, it says a lot about the perception of the Parsis. Let me see. I don't see any hands up. I don't see any questions.
Quite a lot of chat I can see going on at the bottom.
Yeah, they were mostly. Let me see if.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's all about the comments and they're all very, very enthusiastic. So
I have to say it was can I just say something about what sparked the whole thing? Yeah. I was doing some research on behalf of my father, and we took a tour of New England in about quite a long time ago. I would say early 2000s. And we went to the Plymouth colony. The Plymouth colony is frozen in at 1627. And the reenactors in the Plymouth colony, the British part of the Plymouth colony, were cooking lunch. And I wandered in. I said, "What are you cooking?" "Oh, we'll be cooking chicken." And I said, "But I can smell that it's not just chicken. You're cooking it with something. What are you cooking it with?" "Oh, Indian spices." And I said, "Do you mean Native American spices?" "Oh, no, from the East Indies." And I thought then, well, how is it that on the east coast of America in 1627, they are cooking lunch, a roast lunch with spices from the East Indies? And of course, the East India merchants, the Dutch East India merchants, were already bringing spice to Britain in that period. And I found advice, little booklets that were given to the original settlers from the 1630s on as to what they should take with them. And they were advised to bring things like mace and nutmeg and the spices that they would need to enhance the flavorings of the food. And so I said, that's what I thought, well, what's the connection then between America and India at this period? And so that kind of snowballed into the book. But I was fascinated to find that very early reference, the 1788 letter, that is priceless, really.
Great. Okay, so I keep reading enthusiastic comments.
If I may, I have a question.
Yes, we have a question.
Jenny, could you tell us a little more about the fascinating chapter on the ice trade between Boston and Bombay, in which the Parsi merchants were highly engaged?
Yes, I mean, this is a fascinating period of American and Indian history that not a lot of people are aware of. I used to house sit for friends in Sebago Lake in Maine, and they would always tell me, "Oh yes, you know that the ice went from here to China," and I thought it was one of those tall tales until I started researching it, and it was the practice began with an entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor in Boston, who arranged for the ice to be cut. He worked with someone called Nathaniel Wyeth, who had horses that pulled a plow that carved out chunks of ice from the frozen ponds around Boston, and also Walden Pond. Thoreau describes this, watching the ice being cut, and Tudor patented a means of storing the ice. They took it originally with horse-drawn carriages and then by train to specially designed ice houses, and then they put it from the ice houses into these specially designed insulated boxes in the holds of the ship. And because it was below sea level, and the boxes, it was thick planking, and they were put in with their cubes, so there was no space between them. And the residue from the tanning factories originally was put across the top, and later it was sawdust. And then the box was sealed. So it was a housing that was built in the hold of the ship. The box was sealed, and the first cargo of ice that he sent out to Madras went in 1833. And it arrived, went to Calcutta. And it arrived at the entrance to the Hooghly River. When they opened it, only a third of the ice had been lost. They thought more ice would have been lost as it floated up the river. But so he insisted then, if it was obviously going to be a great enterprise, and he insisted that as the ice houses were built, that they should hold 1,000 tons of ice, and that they should be built near to the docks so that they could be loaded. And it was one of the only commodities that was able to be downloaded at night because they didn't want the ice to melt. I mean, it was an incredibly sophisticated endeavor. In Bombay, they didn't build the first ice house large enough. And it took quite a long time for all the subscribers to come together. But the Parsis were amongst the initial subscribers that are listed in the Bombay Times as participating. And Sir Jamsetji Jejeebhoy was one of the first to serve ice cream to his guests at a party, and it was a great novelty. But one of the newspapers reported that quite a few of the guests afterwards caught colds because they hadn't been, or fell ill because they weren't so unused to this new and strange dish that they'd been served.
Very good.
Good. So there is a question, actually. Thanks a lot for the answer. Mehdi Askariye, so he had the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Rose, thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable to hear that. If I may, I'd like to ask a question which is out with your presentation, and if you can address that. What from the censuses that we have in the UK and in the United States of America, do we know that what is the population of the Zoroastrians in the two countries, and whether with a Parsi background or perhaps converts? And also, do we know what sort of a social and political standings they do have, people of the Zoroastrian faith in the UK and in the USA? With a very rich cultural background that they carry with them, that what is their standings in the two countries?
Are you talking about the modern period today?
Today, indeed, today, yes.
Yes. Well, the most recent numbers that I recollect, although someone can prompt me with this if I'm wrong, but there are, I think, about 25 to 30,000 Zoroastrians across North America. There's a largish number in Toronto, and the largest number in California, mostly the Los Angeles, San Diego, but all the way up to San Jose. So I would say those are the two largest representations of Zoroastrians in North America. Although there are pockets across, as for Zana, you know that there are lots of Zoroastrian associations across the country, and up into Canada, of course. In Britain, I'm thinking it's about 5,000, but it could be upwards of that. The British settlement of Parsis begins in the middle of the 19th century. So many of the Parsis that I was talking about who come across to America go through Britain on their way, and they're there for business reasons or for education, or and this is in the middle of the 19th century. But then some of them settle and stay. The author of the diary account of the visit to Canada and the United States, he was one of the founding members of what becomes the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe. So in terms of you asked about social standing. So I'd say in Britain, the Parsis from a fairly early time had fairly high social standing, in that they had already mostly liaised with the British in India, and then came as well-established, mostly men, businessmen, but also began to study at Oxford and Cambridge, and study for the civil service, and so they were of that particular milieu, educated background mostly. But of course, a lot of them came with a Parsi servant. Some of the younger Wadias who spent a couple of years in Britain, in the towards the middle of the 19th century, brought a Parsi servant with them to cook, so that they only ever ate Parsi food. So there was a kind of separateness as well as a joining in. But of course, by the turn of the century, you have the three first Asian members of parliament were all Parsis, including Dadabhai Naoroji. So they're entering into the civic life wholeheartedly from 1860s onwards. Of course, in America, the settlement takes place later and over a much more vast area, and I don't know what the sorry, I'm taking a long time to answer this, but I don't know what the numbers are of those who would identify as Parsi, those who would identify as Iranian, Zoroastrian, and those who would just identify as Zoroastrian. But there is I don't know whether you're aware, but there was a recent Gen Z project that was circulated amongst Zoroastrians globally, and that is the results of that report are online, and there will be lots of statistics that are more relevant to your question that are online, and I can send that to you if that's of interest.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll get your information from Enrico.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have time maybe for another quick question by Manek Mujvala, which is probably the same you were asking in the chat box, right? So you can ask this.
Yeah, I
Hi,
of course. Hi, Dr. Rose. We know each other, but I was interested to know if you may have come across any information about Parsis doing trade from other places besides Bombay, like Surat, or like my mother's family, or Wadia family being from Porbandar, which is the birthplace of Gandhiji. Have you come across anything like that?
Well, of course, the Parsi interaction with the British begins in Surat, because that in 1613 is where the East India Company puts its first factory or warehouse. So we know that it's in Surat that the Parsis are interacting with the British, and there is one letter from Ichabod Nichols to Nusawanji Monekji asking him to send it's a letter of introduction from a friend of his who's a sea captain who's just beginning to trade with India, and he says he's looking for cotton. I suggest that you apply to your friends in Surat where the long best cotton can be found. So obviously the cotton is being supplied, a lot of the cotton is being supplied to Bombay from Gujarat through the port of Surat, one assumes. But you ask about other places. I mean, Kosechi Mwanji had gone on taken a previous American on a tour, that tour up in the Western Ghat Mountains and down to Pune. He'd worked with Richard P. Waters, who had been the American consul in Zanzibar. And so they'd had a lot of trade contact between Zanzibar and Bombay that the Parsis were also running. So you've got that other kind of link as well with the east of Africa.
I see. Thank you again for the great book that you had given to me on one of our trips to the Claremont for a demonstration of our Zoroastrian ceremony. And I read the whole book, a lot of details. You must have spent a lot of time to do the research. And after reading it, I've given it to my daughter. She lives in Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed all the pictures that you showed today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, we also know each other actually, Elisa. So unfortunately, I see that there are other people who have questions, but unfortunately it's 10 past and we have to stop. And if anyone has questions, they can contact Dr. Rose, I guess, and
yes, of
by
course.
email or maybe through us from the Institute. And I'm only left with thanking Dr. Rose and thanks, and also all of those who attended this very, very interesting presentation. And we'll have another one, Dr. Rose. I'll be in touch with you shortly.
Lovely. And thank you all for joining me today. It was wonderful to see so many friends and that I haven't seen for a long time. So this is a wonderful experience for me. Thank you.
Dr. Rose, I also want to thank you for your brilliant presentation and invaluable historical images that you shared.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
To everyone.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.